Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, this educational program. I'm Patricia Vasconcelos, a board member of the Foreign Press Correspondents Association, U.S. correspondent of SBT, Brazilian TV network. Today, we are talking with Professor Michael Edwards. He's a specialist in crisis management and strategic communications. He's a professor at the George Washington University Political Management School. Professor, thank you so much for joining us and give your time and attention to talk to us. So welcome.
Well, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure. And while I'm usually on the campus of the George Washington University for this next month, I'm at the Kennedy School at Harvard University. So as you can see, my setting's a little different, but I'm happy to join you from here in Boston.
Oh, perfect. Such a privilege to talk with you. And so you can teach us and give us some guidance in our profession, I believe. Professor, since March 2020, more than 2 years now, right? When the pandemic officially started, we are experiencing in this world a sequence of worldwide events involving crisis in public health, increase of violence in war zones, food insecurity, environmental and energy instability. How can we identify or recognize a new moment of crisis which deserve a journalistic focus and attention among so many adversities which already exist nowadays?
You raise a very fundamental and important question. Fact of the matter is, crises are not rare or even random events. They are now an ever-present part of our economic, social, political, governmental, and even personal lives. And as a consequence, we're all affected by them. And crises have enormous consequences, not only for the individuals involved, but for the society and individuals that surround them. And so consequently, trying to understand how to prevent, identify, isolate, manage, and sometimes even profit from crises is a fundamental element of leadership in today's world, throughout the world.
But could you give us some examples or tips of how can we identify that a moment, it's a key moment that deserve our special attention?
Most people have a sense that crises are sudden events that cause harm. The reality is very few major crises are really sudden or unpredictable. That doesn't mean the precipitating event, the thing that brings it to the fore, may not be something that cannot be controlled. A hurricane, right? A natural disaster, some kind of upheaval. But if we can't always predict the event, we can always understand that those kinds of events might occur, and that we can prepare to try to avert or manage them more effectively. Quite frankly, many crises, political crises in particular, but corporate crises as well, are really long simmering. And as a result, individuals and organizations, if they put in place processes to begin to assess risk, know what can stop them from achieving their goals, their ends, their strategic mission, and find ways to create systems and structures that allow them to either put in place processes and programs that will inoculate themselves against these crises or minimize their effects.
So can we go through those steps as you mentioned, right? The process.
So again, it's important to realize that crises in themselves are not events. So a hurricane is not a crisis. It is a crisis if it hits a city that's unprepared for it, that hasn't put in the proper preparation, that doesn't have an emergency network set up, that ends up not being able to maintain its power grid, that it doesn't have the right kind or the necessary hospitals and healthcare to do. So what do? In crisis management, we end up having really 6 stages. The first stage is to try to prevent the crisis. It's the least costly in most instances and the most overlooked. And the way we do that is to put together planning teams that try to assess what could go wrong, what could hurt us, right? We can look at things that have happened in the past, we could look at things that are now, but what are the different things that could happen? What are those risks? How would they affect our operations or our ability to deliver our product?
Mm-hmm.
But of course, if we tried to do that, if you and I were trying to chat just about what could go wrong, we'd come up with hundreds, thousands of things, even within a particular industry or for a particular government leader, even within their bailiwick. It's a countless amount. You can't do all those things. So the first thing you actually have to do is try to figure out what are those things that are most likely to happen that would have the greatest impact, right? And to do that, we analyze our strengths, our weaknesses, our opportunities, our threats. We look at how we've behaved in the past and what's happened in that past to ourselves, to others, and what may have changed.
Mm-hmm.
And we begin to prioritize which of those possibilities are most important for us to address. Now, there's some things that are likely to happen, Patricia, but they may have little impact. Standard operating procedures would work in those instances. There are also some things that are unlikely to happen, but could have catastrophic events or impact. So we pay some attention to those. But where we concentrate our efforts are on those things that are likely to happen, or at least highly possible to happen, that have the greatest impact on whatever it is, our government, our services, our company, our campaign, etc. So we first put together an assessment of what that is. Then we think about, can we put in place strategies and approaches that would allow us to minimize the risk? But of course, that's not always successful, and crises do happen. But before we get to that part, we enter the second stage of crisis management, which is crisis preparation. And to do that, we've identified what the most significant risks are. So then we put in place a team of individuals to be helpful in creating a crisis management plan.
Crisis management. If we can open here just a space in order, if you could explain all of those elements that you already put here for us, identifying the situation and preparing ourselves, right? Identifying the risks and our abilities in order to deal with that situation, like to predict. Right. This, I believe, it fits very much in our profession, journalists, and especially international correspondents, right? How we do respond, for example, to a breaking news story and events that we don't have control among those external situations, but we need to react in a very fast way. And from my personal experience, I believe that, of course, years of profession help, but also to have this mindset of preparing, what do I have to do? What steps do I need to take, even if I have a few hours to decide, and a team with me because we don't work together. So my question is, how do you think that those steps or knowledge or skills apply in our profession? Journalists who work abroad as international correspondents.
So as journalists, you have really 2 vantage points for crises. One is how you cover them, And many crises are some of the most important stories that some of us will ever cover, right? I
Yes.
mean, you mentioned as we began some of the crisis events around the world that we're dealing with right now. And if I picked up any one of your newspapers or went to any one of your websites, the number of crises that would emerge from the page would be very significant, right? So as journalists, day in and day out, you're not unused to having to cover fast-breaking stories, right? But all of you also know that if you start at that moment to build expertise about the subject matter, to build contacts and resources, to understand what you have to do to coordinate getting to the site, having the resources, the technology, the camera person, the video feed, whatever it is, you're not going to be successful. So the idea here is to be able to predict and get in front rather than react, right?
Rather than react. This is very important.
Right, because quite frankly, crises are constantly changing and they evolve very, very quickly. And that creates an additional problem for journalists today. And that's because years ago, we used to have what we thought of as a news cycle, right? And that cycle was really about 24 hours. So there was time between deadlines and gathering information. Now, with the change of the internet, social media, the demand for content and the amount of information that gets out there is overwhelming, but it's constantly changing. And I assume that every outlet has a desire to be able to report as early and often on a crisis as possible. So that creates additional challenges if you're trying to do that in a reactive mode. So we always,
and as we're like stress, like
right,
we're constantly dealing with against the clock. And
right, but on the other hand, my 3 rules for journalism are accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. And so the key is getting also the story right. Now, these are, generally speaking, we're talking about important stories. But in the middle of a crisis, right? I mean, just think of one for a moment. They're a cauldron. There's lots of things going on. There's lives that may be at stake, or reputations, or the economy. There's lots of information, too much information, some of it accurate, some of it not. Perspectives change. Things are constantly unfolding. And maybe in certain kinds of crises that there may be barriers to actually talking to people or being on site. All those things create obstacles for both crisis managers and people affected by the crisis, but also journalists in making sure they do get it right. So the more that we're able, before we get to that point, to have build relationships on those areas so that we know where the expertise are and the appropriate spokespeople, so we understand the implications in the real world for what might happen if a bridge collapsed. Again, everyone has a different beat, a different focus.
yeah.
But we're able to work through who and what would be in the event of a crisis, a particular crisis, who, what, when. We can think a little bit more about those in advance. So we're not making those decisions.
Perfect.
So we put together plans. We can often put together teams. Now, again, I'm sure many of your members are individual journalists, but they do have editors back home or other individuals with whom they rely. And as a consequence, thinking of this as a team approach is really very helpful to make sure that the expectations and the goals within a crisis situation, right, are shared by the entire team that works for the newspaper, the news outlet, the television station, et cetera. And of course, all crises aren't equal. We can mention ones that range from an invasion of another country,
Mm-hmm.
the pandemic, or the terrible hurricane or tsunami, to things that are much more constrained or localized or individualized. Their consequences may not be as great for the greater community, but for the individuals involved. And sometimes those are very important stories, right? Even though they only affect a handful of people. So how much time and how much preparation really depends on the nature of the circumstances and what the responsibilities are of the journalist in terms of their assignments and what they're expected to be covering. So go on.
No, yeah, let's keep going. Yeah, you
So if
mentioned
step
some.
one
Mm-hmm.
And step one is to kind of prevent the crisis. What's the risk? What are the potential falls? How do we put things in place to prevent that? Two is to say, all right, should one occur of this particular ilk, what do we do? How do we implement that plan? In crises, by definition, we're talking about doing things that aren't standard operating procedure. If they were sufficient, we wouldn't have to have this conversation. You just say you go about your jobs, doing them as you do every day. But by almost definition of this conversation, crises are something that are outside the norm. Certainly for a crisis manager, for the people affected by it, they have to be thinking beyond their standard operating procedures. For journalists, that may or may not be as big a stretch. It really depends on the nature of crisis. So the second stage is preparing. The third one, which is something that journalists have to do all the time, is actually to identify a crisis, right? Is it a crisis, right? Is this or why is it a crisis? Who's it a crisis for? What are its implications, right? And what does the public, what do my readers, what do my viewers need to know and do as a result of that? Because you really are the way that the rest of the community is connected to what the issue is and how it gets resolved. So then, from a crisis management point of view, the next stage is really crisis isolation and management, right?
Mm-hmm.
From a journalist's point of view, because assuming the crisis isn't affecting you as a journalist per se, but you're covering it, it's really to be able to spend that time in that stage, to be able to really look at what those ramifications are. The immediacy of the precipitating event may have passed, but the residual effects and how it's beginning to affect other people may be creating other crises, right? So if we had recent hurricane, the initial crisis was obviously water levels here in Florida and Mississippi, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But then we ended up having all the implications of that once the immediate moment had passed. The hurricane was over.
This is so important in our
But the
profession,
crisis isn't over,
which
right? So
means maybe to see beyond what it's in our eyes, right? And
exactly,
what is there so obvious, but then
exactly. And in many and that's really part of the responsibility of a journalist, right? To not only explain what happened, but be able to show its implications. And so what happens in the hurricane situation, now you've got afterwards, what does that do to the people's lives, the healthcare system? But also, what does it do to various industries? What does it do in terms of the long-term health of many of the, and quite frankly, for many of you who are here in this country, what are the political implications of that?
what are the political implications on that?
Very often, right?
Very, very
So, yeah. So we then have to kind of manage the crisis. Then at some point, the crisis comes to an end. It gets resolved. And at that stage, really, we have to figure out what happened and why did it happen? And journalists play a key role in helping us do that, of being able to, politicians often have a tendency to move on, government leaders have a tendency to move on, but it's important for us to learn the lessons, not only about what happened, but why it happened and how it might have been prevented or mitigated. So we don't repeat the same crisis in the future. And then it's making those kinds of adjustments. For the organizations involved, for the entities involved, is putting in place operations procedures. For journalists, it's the same thing. It's to looking at your own coverage. What facilitated you being able to do a really good job? And what were those things that created a challenge that made it more difficult for you to adequately cover and explain it? And what might you do in the future to be better prepared to be able to provide the best possible coverage for your newspaper, your television station, your magazine, your webpage, for whatever. Yeah.
You mentioned something so important, which is the political implications. Considering this, how do you think that international journalists can avoid the fact or the situation to be used as a political tool? How to identify this type of situation and choose the right moment, or what to do and what not to do in order to avoid to be used as a political tool? Just experience can tell us.
Well, it can be challenging. It's challenging for two reasons. One, crises often, almost always have, certainly governmental crises, have political ramifications. In fact, when you think about how we look at leaders, we often judge them by how they respond to a crisis. So obviously the connection between the behavior of the entity, the governmental entity that may be responsible, whether it's local, state, national, or international, right, is an important aspect of the story about a crisis. But as you say, that coverage can have implications for the support or opposition to a particular candidate or office holder, because that is how we judge them. But that's true in almost all your coverage, right? That's something that just on a day-by-day aspect. But I would tell you that one of the challenges, I want to say this right, one of the challenges is that in a crisis situation, the people that you're covering have a vested interest in trying to make sure that they control the narrative, right? I teach that, right? How they effectively message in a crisis situation, which is terribly difficult because you've got this swirling amount of information. People want to know, but there's not enough information, or there's too much information coming in. These are organizations that may not be prepared to deal with crises or this particular crisis. They haven't put in place the processes and the procedures to be able to get information and know what it knows and what caused it, et cetera. On the other hand, to keep going, well, we don't have enough information yet, whatever else it is very hard in a crisis situation, because there's a tremendous demand, not just on journalists' part, right? The demand on your part, because the people, your readers and viewers, the people in these communities, that's how they get their information. Even with all of social media, and we shouldn't separate that out from here, but even with social media, the mainstream journalistic channels are still the most substantial and respected sources of information, and is where people turn to in a crisis. So it is a challenge.
It is a challenge.
So you need to create that framework to analyze what that source of information is, what their interests are. And this is a good time where trying to figure out how to get second and third sources and that information and be able to really verify becomes terribly important. Because in a crisis, the people who were adversely affected or may have had a role in it, but I guess everybody's, is usually to get the bleeding to stop as quickly as possible, right? That's what they want to do, is get it over with as quickly as possible. And sometimes that is trying to change the subject, play the blame game, do things to kind of obfuscate or minimize the situation. And that's a challenge to navigate for a journalist. But you folks do it so well in your day-to-day lives. When crises come, the key is not to lose perspective. And that's what happens to us. We end up getting
Such
in
a positive way.
right, we get a bigger, all of a sudden it's a bigger story, it's a bigger whatever. There's more immediacy, there's more attention to it. And there's a tendency, to act and to act quickly before we have the information that we necessarily need. In fact, this bias for action is just a normal part of human behavior. I saw this, I'm going to digress a little bit, but I thought it was really, really interesting. So many of your journalists are European football, soccer fans.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's always very interesting is, and high tension, are penalty kicks, free kicks, where you just have a footballer and the goalie.
Yes.
And the goalie has, and 83% of the time, the kicker puts it in the goal. And the goalie has three options, really: to move to his or her left, to move to his or her right, and to stay in the middle. And there have been some really wonderful studies of this. And what they found is that in most of the instances, goalies, depending upon what they believe the tendency of the kicker is, or their own strengths, etc., do that. They move to the left or the right. And when we analyze time and time again what the most effective strategy is overall, not necessarily on any individual basis, not moving, taking up that center of the goal, is the most effective. And so we ask goalies, why is that? Why did you do that? Right? Why didn't you just stay there? And they have this bias towards action. They go, if I just stood there, the fans would boo, right? Even if, if they went in, or my teammates would be disappointed. They didn't think I worked hard enough. Well, that's true for us in other areas, and it's certainly true for journalists sometimes as well, that we have something, right? And we feel compelled. I don't mean an editor saying, you've got a deadline. You do have a deadline. You have to fit it. But I mean of trying to, sometimes it's important to kind of be able to take at least one deep breath and make sure that we have all that we need. And believe me, in crises, there are plenty of stories, but what you want to do is make sure you get it right. And that's true for journalists.
I love this comparison, and I'm going to think about this pretty often when working. Even you said about that moment of staying in the middle of the goal, right? To one quick breath, maybe just for a fraction of a second, right? So we need to do it. Professor
Patricia, there's another thing that it's important to keep in mind. And I think it may be more true in crises and during the kind of normal flow of events. And that is, journalists have a key role in being able to show what's happening, be able to describe it, analyze it, even opine about it, come to opinions on it. Many of your members, I'm sure, write what we used to call op-ed pieces, essays, editorials, etc., as well as just coverage. But because of the nature of crises and how quickly people are trying to respond, journalists often can become participants in the crisis, sometimes wittingly, but sometimes unknowingly, because what that story is in the middle of it can, because of the urge for everyone else to act, and they see that story, they gravitate to that part of the problem, to that part of the solution, right? When even from their interests and from the more global interests, it is maybe an aspect of assuming it's even accurate, an aspect of the problem, but being able to really identify what the true crisis is, right, is always important. And quite frankly, and we've watched this in organizations for years, whatever the press goes, whatever those stories are like, that kind of affects public opinion about what needs to be done and what the problem is and where often scant resources need to be directed. So again, it is not something that that you take lightly. I know that. That you always give great concern and attention to the to what the story really is and how to get it right. All I'm saying is that in crisis situations, there's even greater sensitivity to do that, and there's more pressure, either because of time or other factors, right, to sometimes move more rapidly than we feel comfortable with. And how to balance that, right, is a part of a journalist's challenge.
You mentioned in one moment the challenge of the social media, right? And how to deal with that. In our daily work nowadays, this is such an important topic. And you also said about the importance of journalism, the real journalism, in comparison with this reality that we are facing in different countries. Could you address a little bit about that? How can we manage our skills during crisis moment in order to deal with all of challenges that come with social media?
Oh, I wish I had a simple
I know, yeah, it's not.
that. And it's not just journalists that are contending with that, right? I mean, decision makers, the public, this idea about both the amount of information that's out there, how accurate it is, how inflammatory or it is a real challenge that we're all out having to confront. In my excuse me, my point of view, the more substantial, the more accurate, the more appropriate the stories of the mainline press, stronger we all are.
Strong, we all are.
Absolutely. And the idea here is that if over the course of time, one recognizes that the most reliable sources of information isn't somebody's, Facebook linked friend that they've never met, who they have no idea about their credentials, but they put a post up there, doesn't mean that it's right. It's just saying that doesn't change people's. What does is having alternatives out there that actually are more helpful to them, that gives them the information they need and may deserve in a way that helps them understand the situation and take whatever appropriate action now or later to deal with it. But I know that it's a challenge, and I know that the amount of inaccurate information and inflammatory information is seems to be increasing, and it can do great damage not only in crisis situations, but just in how we are able to make decisions about everything from who we elect for president to what soap we buy. And so to me, as I've gotten older, my view in life has become more and more for me to concentrate on those things that I can change, that I can control, as opposed to those that others. And I'd suggest that it's going to be very challenging for us to change other behavior about how people go to these sources, whether it's Twitter or websites or Facebook or Instagram, etc. And more, what can we do to create a good alternative that people find reliable, that they find valid, that they find helpful to them? And so to me, the thing that we can do better than anything else is not contribute to that kind of frenzy that's out there, and instead step back and realize that the most important thing for a journalist is to be able to get the story right and communicate it in ways that help people understand the world around them in a meaningful and helpful way.
Super positive and helpful words. So thank you so much. In your course, if I'm not wrong, you also talk about crisis versus scandals, how to deal with limits, give guidance to minimize negative effects, right? You also talk about ethical standards. How does this apply to our daily work, journalists? Very often we're dealing with scandals, right? And with this daily challenges of how to minimize negative effects.
Right. So every crisis isn't a scandal, and every scandal may not be a crisis, but there's no question that particularly in the political world, and sometimes among the corporate world, scandal can become an important issue and a crisis for the individuals involved or for their institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, the best way to avoid scandals is to not engage in the behavior in the first place, the
Great.
scandal. And by the way, and as you well know, there's no dearth of examples of people who clearly should have known better and did know better who go down that road. First of all, scandals generally are they're an interesting category of transgressions. Things that are really big, we don't usually think of as a scandal, right? Genocide, right? They're and things that are really minimal and nobody knows about it isn't a scandal. Scandals usually end up having to deal with uh, character, with transgressions against what most people would think of as kind of moral, ethical standards.
Personal behaviors.
It's often personal behavior. So institutions can engage in behavior as well. Right. And quite frankly, when I look at it and I ask people to name scandals, they usually fall into three categories: money, power, sex. Which are and whether that and the question then becomes, first of all, how does one avoid that? And it is not that complicated, right?
It's not that complicated. Yeah, we know.
Usually it's not that complicated. Most of that complicated. Now, for a scandal, right? The question about how to deal with it in the what one would normally teach is pretty straightforward, right? The idea is that you certainly want to get it over with as quickly possible, and the way you do that is to accept responsibility, right? Admit whatever mistakes you made, promise or engage in behavior that is going to be appropriate compensation or accountability that people would expect, would see as a fair, I don't want to just call it punishment, but a fair response, right? That people want to be able to make sure that you're committed not to do it again, and to bring people in to the degree possible to have them kind of help, I don't want to say monitor, but with a solution to the problem, right? So that's easy to say. I will tell you that when it comes to corporate leaders and politicians, though, their gut reaction is something very different. There's a tendency for them when they're caught to immediately go into denial, try and play the blame game, to switch the story, to blame the messenger, and to cover up. And we've had in American political history for the last now almost 50 years, this idea that in more often not for politicians, it's a cover up, and for corporations, it's a cover up more than the crime, right? The things that they actually end up doing to try and hide from the truth and accountability right? Which often end into an abuse of power, an obstruction of justice, the lack of truth. Those things often are more their downfall than the original inappropriate act. So the challenge for a journalist, I think, is that scandals tend to be very good news. I mean, story as story.
The fact itself, it's a story, right?
It's a story,
And
they
it happens,
capture,
how it
right?
happens.
Right, they have all the good elements of a story. They can be, they're particularly for people who are interested in the failings of government. And by the way, it's important for people to know about governmental character. That's what scandals are all about. They may be about criminal activity or inappropriate, but by and large, in at least a political scandal, it tells the voter and it tells the public something about the character of the individual. And that's important in making a decision as to whether or not you do or don't want to support her or him in the future. But because they can be often really interesting human stories, they can expose the failings of the powerful because they do deal with sex and power and money. There's a tendency sometimes to take them a little bit out of context, and that they become bigger news stories than perhaps they deserve. I'm not going to make that judgment.
This is interesting. And so should we cover that? Should we still keep covering that? Oh, it's not the focus anymore. And another question is how to, of course, we need to read all the time, but how to ask the right questions. This is, we talk a lot about the right questions during press conferences, for example. Sometimes not all of us, we have the chance to raise the hand, but not all of us have the chance to ask the right questions. And pretty often I hear from other colleagues, but we didn't ask that. So we need to ask better questions. Is it a main point?
Yeah, but I think, obviously asking good questions is an essential tool for journalists, right? And the better the question, the better the information that you're going to be able to ascertain. The challenge, of course, is that everyone wants to talk in sound bites and and that's certainly true about what we try and anybody who's teaching the other side of it, right? About for people how to have an effective message in answering your questions, or going to learn how to talk in slogans and things. My view is the good questions are one that are very hard for them to be able to just say yes or no, though that may be all you want. And they're ones that actually make it more challenging to go into. Patricia, that's an excellent question. And as you know, I have always believed in the blah, 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 blah. And I am absolutely, and you've got the message box, the message triangle that they're giving you that is, again, trying to wall off all those other things. Finding questions that can penetrate that, the whys, why did this happen? And trying to figure out, again, what is this story? Why is this story important, right? I mean, is it just that, aha, we got them? Or does it tell us something more about his behavior, their role in office, behavior that they've done in the past, how it's influenced other people? What has it shaped governmental decision-making or corporate decision-making? Why does this really matter, right? What makes it, let's take one where a member of the government or a candidate has had an extramarital relationship, right? Now, that can be a scandal. It's certainly a transgression of within her or his family, and obviously something that could be called scandalous behavior. The question then ends up being, from a journalist's point of view, and I'm not sure there's a right or wrong answer, but from the circumstances, what makes that a story? Why is that relevant? What are the implications for that, right? And so what do we want to, how do we utilize that in a meaningful kind of way? And then where do we put it in the newspaper, right? Is it on the front page above the fold? Or is there a different place? Again, those are decisions for you to make, for journalists as professionals to make, but it should be done consciously. And it's not just a gotcha, because the real story isn't that. The real story is deep down is about the character of the individual and how that's going to affect or has affected their performance in office or their leadership capacity or their running of their corporation. So to me, I come back to the fact that in all these things, there's no totally unique, different part of the world. The fundamental things that journalists bring to their job every single day, or should bring to their job, should hold them in good stead here. It's just that these circumstances create slightly different environments that say, let's just make sure we've got it right. And not that you shouldn't do that all the time, but let's just make sure we've got the right story and we're looking at it from the right point of view. And we're making sure that what we do to make sure that we know the who, what, when, why, right, really make sense to us. So we'll see. We've actually, the one thing that is most interesting to me, and I'm not sure where it goes, we've had over the last, not these last 2 years, but the 4 years between that, from 2016 to 2020, a president in this country whose approach to crisis management would be against what virtually any professional crisis management consultant would tell them, right? His view, quite frankly, and this is not a partisan view, has been deny, delay, blame the messenger, change the subject, right? Cast blame, go to court. I mean, that was President Trump's modus operandi. And the question is, will that now affect, was it effective, right? We'll see that over the course of time. But will that now begin to affect the approach that other government officials, candidates, people in the public eye see as an effective way to deal with these kinds of situations? Or would they do what has long been the accepted and what felt to be the appropriate approach, which was to accept whatever responsibility you have, to promise to compensate or take corrective action, to not do the same things again, and how things are going to be the difference. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch over the next couple of years in terms of crisis behavior and scandal behavior. And I'm not really sure how that's going to go. I'm not sure what may have worked or not worked for President Trump will work for candidates at other levels, but it's an interesting thing to look at.
If you have more 15 minutes, I have just one last question that I believe it fits exactly where we are in our interview now. You also teach about how to discern reputational and electoral consequences of a scandal. And we're living moments exactly like this in different parts of the world. So could you explain, please, how this apply into our daily work?
Well, the way, first of all, my basic advice to candidates, et cetera, is you avoid the behavior to begin with, right? There's absolutely no justifiable means to do something that is, well, unlawful, inappropriate, immoral, et cetera, right? We might differ on what those standards are a little bit, but there are lines that are obviously inappropriate to cross. Best crisis management advice: don't cross them, right? Don't cross them. And then the challenge ends up being then from, if I'm giving advice to a candidate, is to try and figure out what, I always give the same advice to get it over, but from a candidate's point of view, you also want to know the extent of the crisis and what other things you might have to do. And we do that in fairly traditional ways, the way we judge voter behavior in other circumstances, that we poll and do focus groups and find ways to get feedback, and we see what the press is writing about us, et cetera. Here's the thing that I try and tell candidates. There is some evidence that despite all the publicity that scandals get, their impact, at least on incumbents, is not as significant as people would think if you use as your criteria of measurement success in the next election. So what we find when you kind of do the analysis, that most incumbents, even those that are beset by crises, are successful in their next reelection. And as a result of that, there are a number of people who don't take a scandal, their own scandal, that seriously. And that's a huge mistake, because there are significant ramifications, but they may not be manifested in just the immediate next election. And there are a lot of reasons for that. The first reason for that is that just the timing of the election cycle, right? So depending upon how close or far away you are, the candidates have already been set, right? It may have less chance to either sink in or be responded to. The second thing is that there's a fair number of individuals beset by scandal that decide not to run for re-election. So they don't count anymore, right? So if they don't run, they don't lose. The third thing is that we find that there is a distinction based upon whether or not in this country one scandal results in a challenge in the primary campaign versus the general election. So here's what the survey research really tells us. In a primary campaign, you usually end up in American political parties today. You usually have a fairly high degree of policy agreement, right? And the candidates are usually arguing much more over who would represent people better, how much experience they have, but in many ways, their character. As a consequence to that, we find that scandals actually have a greater impact in primary contests, where the character issue is there, but the policy differences aren't that great, than in the general election, where American voters tend to side with candidates who agree with how they feel about the issues and what they're going to do for them. And that becomes more important to them than their character as good, decent human beings. Now, having said that,
recent history proves that this is true, right? So.
Right. That's what I'm saying. That's at least the past. But having said that, there are really important things to recognize as well. That's just looking at the immediate election, the next election coming up. And when you look over the course of time, what we find is candidates that are, or office holders that are beset by scandal, they end up getting stronger opposition in future elections, right? The candidates who run against them are stronger. Their fundraising of their opponents tends to go up. Their own tends to go down. They tend to be not as secure in future elections. They tend to actually then be more vulnerable in future elections as well. They often are no longer, they may have been reelected to that level, but are less likely, far less likely to be successful running for what would be considered a higher office. So if they're the member of the House, the idea of becoming a senator or a governor, or that's unlikely. Their leadership positions in Congress are much less likely to occur. They're less likely to get the kind of roles that put them in the forefront of their party. And their legislative effectiveness tends to go down as well, both in terms of how they interrelate to their colleagues in getting votes, but also how they relate to constituents and interest groups in getting their support for their legislation. So I don't want it to seem as if scandal doesn't have and can have a really dramatic impact on someone's political career. It just may not be as evident in the first election after that as one might think.
Do you think that as journalists, correspondents should pay too much attention in those cases, scandals, or do not let the tendency to do that because we think it's a good story and the audience is gonna like it very much? And
it depends. I mean, again, there are scandals that are truly jeopardize people's lives or the well-being of the country, or there can be a scandal that can, because it's a banking scandal, that can not only bring down the bank but have economic effects on tens of thousands of people. So, but that may be different than whether or not a CEO bounced a check once or not, and the bank covered it up. Not saying to ignore smaller things. It's just to use your journalistic principles to figure out, okay, what's a story here? What is it news? Why is it news? And then where do we place it so that it is put in its proper context? And that's what you do every single day. What I try and explain to people when we talk about the press is that every newspaper page, and I'll just use newspapers as a shorthand for journalism generally, begins blank. Someone in your industry has to decide what goes on it. They have to select. And once they select it, you can't put everything that you select there, so you have to edit it. You have to decide what's important.
yes.
And then after that, you have to highlight, right? Something has to be the lead.
Yes.
And it has to be placed someplace in the newspaper.
So
and
that's why we believe in common sense, right?
Right, exactly right. But you have to do that. And the other things that you do is that you then you give opinions. You have editorial pages and guest essays and your own essays, and you provide forum, for people to be able to discuss these issues. So it used to be letters to the editor or something, but now almost all of you that end up having a web presence for your publication or your also have comment sections and the ability for your viewers or your readers to make comments, right? So all those things are subject to journalistic judgment. We've been doing a fabulous job for hundreds of years. That's not going to change. Crises don't change that. Scandals don't change that. What they do is they just create another screen that one looks at to recognize that in these particular situations, is there some additional data that I want to put into that decision about why this is news, who it's news for, and how we want to show and explain the story. And my own view is always the same. If journalists go back to their basic principles and beliefs, the things that all of you, all of you learned either in journalism school or over the course of your career about what makes a good story and what your responsibilities are, you will be just as fine in crises as you are in every single day life.
Professor Michael Edwards, I've learned so much. I wanted to stay here listening more and more, honestly. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. And it's been a great pleasure. And I look forward to reading and seeing what you and your colleagues will write from every day. I mean, my day doesn't start without reading the news.
Oh, this is awesome. Good to know. I'm sure.
But you are my connection to the rest of the world.
Oh.
And you are. And I mean, I think it's important. There's a heavy responsibility because quite frankly, you're not just my connection to the rest of the world, but you're you're the people's connection to the rest of the world, and you play a really unbelievable responsibility. Here in this country, we traditionally used to think of the press as a force of state, an essential element in our public, our political, our economic, and our social lives. That's always been the case, and I believe it always will be. And we're very, very thankful to have people like you and your members around the world taking on this very real and very heavy responsibility. So thank you.
And so much respect in the name of all my colleagues, foreign journalists who are part of the association. Thank you very much for your work. We work so hard. We've been working so hard, right, in order to deliver this daily work, which we believe it's so important. So thank you so much. I spoke today with Professor Michael Edwards, a specialist in crisis management and strategic communications. He's a professor at the George Washington University of Political Management School, and today spoke with us from Harvard Kennedy School. So thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.